It's 1969. A small country in Southeast Asia has just experienced race riots. Its economy depends mostly on rubber and tin. Most of its people are poor. Foreign investors are cautious, and its political future looks fragile. Few people at the time would have guessed that this same country would eventually become one of Southeast Asia's most stable and relatively wealthy economies. But that is exactly what happened to Malaysia. Today, Malaysia's GDP per person is more than 5 times higher than it was in the 1970s. The country exports electronics, builds advanced infrastructure, and hosts major global manufacturers. So the obvious question is simple: how did Malaysia get so rich? And the answer is complicated, because Malaysia didn't follow the clean economic playbook that textbooks love to describe. Its success came from a strange mix of state control, global capitalism, political engineering, and a little bit of historical luck. To understand the story, you have to go back to the beginning. Malaysia became independent from Britain in 1957. On paper, it had resources, rubber plantations, tin mines, strategic shipping routes. But resources alone don't make countries rich. Many nations with far more natural wealth remain poor. The real problem was structure. Most of the economy was controlled by foreign companies. British firms ran plantations and mines. Local industries were weak. Manufacturing barely existed. Even worse, wealth was unevenly distributed between ethnic groups. Ethnic Chinese Malaysians dominated business and commerce. Ethnic Malays, who formed the political majority, were significantly poorer on average. This imbalance created constant tension, and in 1969, that tension exploded. Violent racial riots broke out after a contested election. Hundreds died. The country entered a political crisis that forced Malaysia's leaders to rethink the entire economic system. The government responded with something bold. In 1971, Malaysia launched the new economic policy. On the surface, the policy had two goals: reduce poverty and restructure the economy so that ethnic Malays would control a larger share of national wealth. But the way Malaysia pursued these goals was unusual. Instead of letting markets sort things out naturally, the government intervened aggressively. Companies were required to allocate shares to ethnic Malay investors. Universities introduced quotas. Government agencies began actively building Malay-owned businesses. Critics at the time called it social engineering, and in some ways they were right. But something unexpected happened. The policy stabilized the country. Political tensions cooled, a growing Malay middle class emerged, and the government gained enough legitimacy to focus on the next stage of development: industrialization. This is where Malaysia made its most important move. In the 1970s and 1982, many developing countries tried to build industries by protecting domestic companies from foreign competition. They raised tariffs, restricted imports, forced local manufacturing. Most of those experiments failed. Malaysia did almost the opposite. Instead of shutting out the world, it invited it in. Foreign companies were encouraged to invest. Export zones were created. Taxes were lowered for manufacturers willing to build factories. American, Japanese, and European electronics companies arrived. They built semiconductor plants, assembly lines, supply chains. Cities like Penang slowly transformed into industrial hubs. Factories produced chips, circuit boards, and electrical components that would be shipped across the world. Malaysia wasn't inventing the technology, but it was becoming extremely good at producing it. And this strategy worked for a simple reason. Malaysia offered something global companies desperately wanted: stability. Compared with many neighboring countries at the time, Malaysia had relatively predictable politics, decent infrastructure, and a workforce that could be trained quickly. Foreign investment poured in, manufacturing exploded, exports surged, but there was still another ingredient in Malaysia's growth story. The government didn't just sit back and watch. It built powerful state-linked companies that controlled major industries. Petronas, the national oil company, became one of the most profitable state-owned energy firms in the world. Government investment funds began buying stakes in banks, telecom companies, and infrastructure projects. In many Western economic textbooks, this level of state involvement is often criticized, but Malaysia's version was pragmatic rather than ideological. Some projects failed, some state companies were inefficient, but others became extremely successful. And the profits helped fund highways, airports, and education. Then came the 1990s. Malaysia's economy was booming. Skyscrapers were rising in Kuala Lumpur. Mega projects were being announced. The famous Petronas Towers became a symbol of national ambition. The country was growing at nearly 8% per year. It looked unstoppable until the Asian financial crisis arrived in 1997. Currencies across Southeast Asia collapsed, capital fled. Stock markets crashed, many countries accepted bailout programs that required deep austerity measures. Malaysia did something different. Its prime minister at the time, Mahathir Mohamad, made a controversial decision. He imposed capital controls. Investors were temporarily prevented from pulling money out of the country. The currency was fixed. Financial markets were stabilized by government intervention. International economists were horrified. At the time, the decision was widely criticized, but Malaysia recovered faster than many expected. The economy stabilized, growth returned, and the country avoided the kind of prolonged recession that hit some of its neighbors. Now, none of this means Malaysia's rise has been smooth. There are serious complications. Income inequality remains an issue. Many government-linked companies are still criticized for inefficiency and political influence, and some economic policies designed decades ago to reduce ethnic inequality are increasingly debated today. But despite these challenges, Malaysia achieved something remarkable. It escaped the middle-income trap that captures many developing nations. The country moved from exporting raw materials to exporting manufactured goods. Rubber and tin gave way to electronics and machinery. Palm oil plantations still exist, but they no longer define the entire economy. Today, Malaysia is one of the world's largest exporters of semiconductors and electronic components. Millions of people entered the middle class, infrastructure improved dramatically, and the country built a diversified economy that many analysts once thought impossible. But here is the uncomfortable part of the story. Malaysia's success wasn't built on a single perfect economic model. It was messy. The government intervened heavily in markets. Foreign corporations played a massive role in building domestic industries. Ethnic quotas shaped corporate ownership. State companies controlled strategic sectors. Some economists would say the system is too controlled. Others would say it's not controlled enough. And yet somehow the combination worked, at least so far, because Malaysia now faces a different challenge. The strategy that made the country rich may not be enough to make it richer. Cheap manufacturing is becoming less competitive. Countries like Vietnam are attracting the next wave of factories. Automation is replacing low-cost labor, and high-income economies rely more on innovation than production, which raises a difficult question. Malaysia mastered the art of becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. But can it become an innovation powerhouse? Can it move from assembling technology to inventing it? History suggests that the next stage of development is always the hardest. Factories are one thing. Global technology leadership is another. And so Malaysia stands at an interesting moment. A country that once struggled with poverty and political instability now finds itself competing in a much more complex global economy. The rise was impressive. The next step may be even harder, because the strategy that transformed Malaysia into a rich nation was built for the 20th century. The question now is whether that same system can survive the 21st.